Good morning! I want to start off today's episode by saying I voted this week. My family and I drove to our polling place before sunrise and waited 30 minutes in the pouring rain to cast our ballots. We are just such a passionate Jo Jorgensen family that we knew we needed to get there early to make sure she won so that she could strip down Medicare, defund public schools, take away taxes from the rich, and remove environmental regulations. You know, as my dad always said, a vote for Jo Jorgensen is a vote for your mortgage, son. Now let's get into some good normal news from this good normal country. Biden eyes Republican candidates for cabinet slots. Major RNC Trump fundraiser Elliott Broidy pleads guilty to acting as unregistered foreign agent. McConnell urges White House not to strike stimulus deal before election. Rudy Giuliani caught in compromising position in new Borat film. Trump calls Dr. Fauci disaster, says he would fire him if it weren't for negative press. Donald Trump posts raw footage of 60 Minutes interview. CBS News says White House broke agreement. Deposition of Ghislaine Maxwell charged in Epstein case is revealed. Parents of 545 separated at the border cannot be found. On Thursday, Biden and Trump faced off for the last time in the second presidential debate. Unlike last month's debate, the moderator was able to maintain civility between both septuagenarians for the majority of the 90 minutes. Kristen Lucker and the American people benefited from their mics being muted after their responses to the initial questions. And for all the posturing Trump did about thinking he came out on top after the last debate, his shift away from being the petulant child that he was signaled that the hit he took in the polls as a result of his performance convinced him that his strategy wasn't a winning one. He did a much better job biting his tongue and presenting himself as half respectful this time, but the new strategy came with its own set of faults. By giving Biden the room to outline his substantive points and attacks against the current administration's failures, Trump trapped himself into playing defense for the majority of the time. Biden's attacks on Trump's coronavirus response, refusal to invest in green energy, and horrific family separation policy at the border forced Trump on his heels and took away from his ability to strike any meaningful blows against his Democratic challenger. Trump's strategy would have only worked if Joe didn't show up prepared, and that was a real possibility. Joe's debate performances for the past year have been pretty inconsistent, from his lackluster performances at the primaries to his decent one against Bernie. But Thursday's Biden was the best we've seen him in a long time. He came prepared with policy proposals, he skillfully dodged and pivoted away from personal attacks, and, as always, he came off as the more empathetic candidate at a time when the American people are desperate for that kind of empathy. Biden was also uncharacteristically good with his comebacks. When Trump said, "People are learning to live with the virus," Biden said, "People are learning to die with the virus." When Trump tried to bring Hunter into conversation, Biden very effectively pointed out that this debate shouldn't be about the candidates' families. It should be about the millions of families struggling to survive right now. And even when Trump tried to nail him on his 1994 crime bill, which has proven to be somewhat of an albatross, Biden was able to express remorse for the bill, point out Trump's own racist past with the Central Park Five, mention the thousands of prison sentences he and Obama commuted, and outline potential future prison reform he would work to implement. But Trump's strategy of forced silence couldn't stop him from making some ridiculous comments anyway. Some highlights include, "I'm the least racist person in this room," speaking directly to a black moderator. "When you say they come back, they don't come back, Joe. They never come back. Only the really, and I hate to say this, but those with the lowest IQ, they may come back." Referring to asylum seekers ditching court appearances, and of course, the piece de resistance. "I know more about wind than you do. It's extremely expensive. Kills all the birds." All in all, Trump didn't self-immolate like he did last time, but Biden was up to task to face off. Polls that came out after the debate show that Biden came out on top, but the numbers correlate more or less with the national polling averages anyway, so the likelihood that this changed anything about the race isn't all that high. On Tuesday, the Justice Department sued Google for violating antitrust law. The DOJ is accusing Google of using anti-competitive tactics to maintain and extend its monopolies in search and search advertising. Google responded in a blog post by calling the lawsuit deeply flawed and saying that the complaint would do nothing to benefit consumers. Google also addresses the DOJ's allegations point by point, but for the sake of time, I won't be covering each response, so I implore you to read the link I've put in the description. This is the biggest antitrust lawsuit since a similar complaint was leveled against Microsoft in the late 90s. And even though I don't agree with basically anything the current administration does, I think this is a really good move. And I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on Google, regardless if they win the case or not. And that could take decades. It's going to open the door for Google's competitors, and it could potentially be a first step into a larger war against monopolistic powers more broadly. Attitudes towards big tech have been increasingly negative over the past few years, so it isn't a stretch to think that there will be public support for the regulation or even breaking up of these giant corporations. Luis Arce, the presidential candidate for Bolivia's Socialist Party, secured a massive victory in this week's election. This result is especially important because it further delegitimizes the US-supported coup that stripped Evo Morales, the former socialist president of Bolivia, of his power. Morales had been a coca grower before assuming office as the country's first indigenous president. Once in power, Morales invested in social spending and implemented economic policies that raised millions out of poverty. He nationalized oil and gas, redistributed hundreds of millions of acres of land to indigenous families, redirected revenue into schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. He established programs that paid millions of children to stay in school, created monthly pension programs for people older than 60, provided cash bonuses to pregnant women and recent mothers who regularly visited healthcare facilities. Morales' policies resulted in Bolivia becoming the fastest growing economy in Latin America. The real per capita GDP grew by more than 50% in 13 years. Poverty fell from 60% in 2006 to 35% in 2017, with extreme poverty going from 38% to 15%. After Bolivia's highest court overruled term limits in 2017, Evo Morales was able to run for a fourth term, and so he did. Many of his right-wing opponents came out against Morales' admittedly autocratic push for a fourth term. So when Morales came out the victor of the 2019 election, the Bolivian military, backed by the United States, who was looking out for their own capital interests, claimed voter fraud and forced Morales to resign and leave the country. Once the position was vacant, the military installed Janine Áñez, a far-right evangelical Christian whose party only received 4% of the vote, as interim president. She went on to postpone the election twice and persecute journalists, political opponents, and human rights activists. After her government massacred 19 unarmed indigenous protesters, she thanked God and the military in the name of democracy for pacifying the country. But because the US supported Áñez's coup in the name of profit, little to no media attention was given to the atrocities being perpetrated by the administration. Elon Musk was one of the most prominent supporters of the coup in Bolivia because Morales' push to nationalize the country's lithium posed a tremendous threat to Elon Musk's profit margins. Tesla relies on cheap lithium, mostly from Australia, but the price of lithium globally depends on its accessibility. So when the accessibility was threatened, Elon Musk and his financial influence supported anything that would keep lithium accessible to foreign private entities. When pressed about his support for the coup on Twitter, Musk responded by tweeting, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." So, the Bolivian people decided to deal with it by overwhelmingly voting for Luis Arce in this week's election, effectively putting an end to the government's reign of terror and an end to Musk's lithium pipe dreams. Arce received 55% of the vote, enough to avoid a runoff, while Camacho, one of the conservative leaders that forced Morales into exile, only received 14%. In the 195 years Bolivia's been a country, there have been 190 revolutions and coups. Serving for 14 years, Evo Morales was the longest-serving president. He provided stability, growth, and prosperity that improved the lives of millions. But that is not to say there are no legitimate critiques of Morales. There are allegations of corruption. There's evidence that his administration prioritized the profits of some Brazilian countries over those of indigenous families. And his hesitation to tackle climate change and deforestation head-on has wreaked some pretty substantial environmental damage. But Bolivians recognize the urgent need for socialist policies. So, they elected the person that would bring them back. For once, it seems that the US's efforts to to install far-right dictators in Latin America didn't stick, and that the will of the people triumphed. And that is definitely cause for celebration. Turning now to an election a little closer to home, let's take a look at the state of the race. Not much has changed since last week. Biden still leads by 10 points nationally and in the high single digits in important swing states. With only 2 weeks to go, over 52 million people have already voted. And the last debate probably didn't change anything. Listen, it isn't impossible that Trump wins. I don't want to send that message. But it is becoming increasingly clear that Trump is a huge underdog in this fight. But even though numbers are looking really good for Biden, people are still convinced that Trump is going to win. At the risk of being very, very wrong in 2 weeks, I'm going to quickly go over why polls this year are much better for Democrats than they were in 2016. For one, there are way fewer undecided voters. One of the reasons Trump was able to eke out an electoral victory last time was because undecideds broke disproportionately his way. Secondly, Biden is consistently getting over 50% in swing state polls, whereas Clinton barely if ever reached that milestone. Thirdly, many polls in 2016 didn't include an education screen, which ended up being very important in predicting who would vote for Trump. Pollsters have since corrected that mistake, presumably at least becoming marginally more accurate. There have also been a ton more polls this cycle when compared to 2016. That means the averages are more robust and less subject to be the product of an outlier in either direction. And ignoring the ways polls are very likely more accurate this year, even if they were as wrong as they were in 2016, Biden would win over 300 electoral votes. As for the Senate and the House, Democrats are also positioned to take and retain control. I won't go into specific races again. I'll just throw up some graphs of the most important races. All right, take a look. You looking? Okay. Good? Finished? All right. We are so close to the end. That last debate was Trump's last chance to really turn things around, and he squandered it. Short of like a Comey letter on top of a Comey letter on top of a Comey letter, I don't see how this is going to go his way. If you want to learn more about any of the stories I talked about today, check out the links in the description. If you want to keep forcing me to wake up early on Saturdays, like and subscribe. Have a great weekend.